Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. This is the France 24 debate. We're talking about the World Cup coming to the land of samba football, Brazil, and the question whether it'll be a fiesta or a fiasco. An unimaginable question before we saw those unprecedented demonstrations of 1 year ago. With us to talk about it from sister station Radio France International, Cintia CARDOSO. Welcome back as well to Brazilian activist Rodrigo De Rezende, who hails from Sao Paulo, host city for the opening match. Marc BURLEIGH of the French news agency AFP, who's also posted to Sao Paulo.
Yes, for 4 years.
All right, and joining us from Bristol, David GOLDBLATT, the author of Football Nation, a footballing history of Brazil. Just before the break, David, you were telling us that there's a break with a past when it comes to how Brazilians see football. There was a couple of days ago, David, Leonardo, who former international, who's now one of the managers of the Paris football team, saying this is the first time when the players are going to have to win over their fans. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I think the jury is out on that. During the Confederations Cup, there was support for the protest and acknowledgement of the problems from the players. And while they're not the most exciting Brazil team that's ever played, they won last year. They've won all their friendlies this year. Broadly, most people are sympathetic to the team. They don't see them as the problem. If there is an area where they have to win people over, it's dealing with the gap that's open between the average Brazilian and a football player and a star in Europe. It wasn't so long ago, but the wage differentials between an average Brazilian and a football player weren't gigantic. Now they're the size of a galaxy. They live completely different lives in completely different worlds. And crossing that bridge, making that link, is really difficult.
And we talk about the costs to the average Brazilian. There's, in Britain, there's Wembley Stadium in London, which is sort of the temple of European football for many. Brazil has the Maracanã. Now, they redid it for the tournament, and now there's no more of the terraces, and the price of the seats has gone up. Is the Maracanã still the Maracanã?
Well, I haven't been there yet after the renewal. I was there several times before, but now it's true that it became very expensive for an average fan to go to see a match, not only a Brazilian game, but any in the country. So, of course, it makes this feeling that Maracanã does not belong to the people anymore, because it became so expensive to go inside. I mean, an average would cost around 50 reais, that would be 15, 20 euros to go to a stadium, so it's very expensive. There is no more this very popular feeling that it was, of course, for security reasons, because when Maracanã was built, there was 200,000 places, and of course
200,000 capacity.
Yeah, because we have a lot of people around the field, and they stand and they have their little radios to see. Of course, now it's it's another era, but of course it became very expensive, and to go to watch a game in Maracanã, and it's a pity, of course.
Marc BURLEIGH, safety first, or was there a way for the Maracanãs to keep its soul?
I think obviously safety has to come into it in this day. There are a lot of things that are unsafe in Brazil, honestly. So it's probably good, because a lot of things hasn't been renovated for 20, 30 years, and standards have changed. And honestly, even the airports, a lot of the airports need a lot of work. There is, I think, though, that feeds into an overall feeling that the corporations have taken over what is supposed to be a popular sport. The people are being excluded, and it's all the big sponsors that are effectively pushing people around and pushing the people out of the stadium. I think that fuels that feeling.
David GOLDBLATT, how could you have given a makeover to a stadium like the Maracanã in Rio and not excluded the working man or the working woman?
Well, it would have been terribly easy to if they hadn't handed over the Maracanã to a private corporation orientated towards profit. And particularly so given that the Brazilian state, in the 3 renovations of the Maracanã over the last 15 years, has spent something close to $400 million, and they have handed it over to a private consortium for a fraction of the cost with barely any repayments. And yet they allow them, on this basis, to charge the most outrageous prices. And that's true of also Brazil's football clubs, which set prices for many of the games. So the problem is, it's no wonder that we've got this problem.
Is this going to have an impact in the long run, Rodrigo, on Brazilian football?
Well, I think it's something that's already happened to football, even in Europe. Everyone knows it's become so much of a business and so little of a game. And I have a lot of football-loving friends that would rather go to second or third division matches because they just don't have a feeling for it anymore. Yeah, certainly. I think in Brazil, affluence to the stadia is already going down.
All right, we mentioned the Maracana. There's plenty of suspense, by the way, in the remote Amazonian city of Manaus. That's where England play Italy Sunday in one of the toughest groups of the group phase of the World Cup. But actually, the suspense is not just on the pitch, but it's also to get the parched pitch ready in time. The pitch is not in good condition. It's a 42,000-seat stadium, Marc BURLEIGH, and it's going to host 4 matches during the World Cup.
Yeah, pretty amazing figures, isn't it? Going back to what you said, though, it's sort of like you got to get these people around inside of a country which is massive. I mean, it's essentially almost the same size as the United States if you don't count Alaska. But it's a huge country. The prices, though, are even more expensive to get from. If you're going to go from Sao Paulo, Rio up to Manaus, you could almost get to Europe for what you're paying for some of the prices, or at least to Miami or ridiculous. And then you get in there, and everywhere I've seen in Brazil, pretty much, there's a problem with hotel capacity, and then the prices for the hotels. I just don't know how they're going to do.
But what's going to happen to that stadium after those 4 matches?
Nobody knows exactly.
Well, talking about white elephants, yeah, and I don't know. A country like Brazil, what do you think would happen?
There was a huge opera house built in Manaus after a rubber boom, and I think this is going to be something similar to that. A white elephant that stands there and that might be used.
Nobody goes to the opera.
I think they've renewed it. But that's not that's not a working man passion. That's not a big sport either in Brazil.
Okay, so but more seriously, there's a lot of money that's been spent on this.
Yeah, actually, because the local tournament, when it gathers 10,000 fans, it's a huge success. So, can you imagine how they're going to keep on the full capacity, 40,000 seats of the local tournament? Of course, the government doesn't really have a right answer yet. They say it might be maybe used as a mall, as a convention center, or eventually a prison, maybe. So there's all kinds of ideas, but so far not a really straight answer. And of course, the local clubs, they cannot afford to have such a stadium.
All right, local clubs can't afford it. There's a similar problem, I suppose, but more about infrastructure in the northern coastal city of Natal. There, too, mixed feelings about all the construction around their new stadium.
The beach was totally wrecked. Nobody went there. Today there's much better access with steps, ramps and pavement. The beach is in a much better state than this time a year ago. It will give people a good impression of our city.
There will be fewer tourists. You've seen what it's like. It's not good at all.
All right, so some of the locals not convinced by that argument there. Rodrigo De Rezende, as Marc BURLEIGH was saying, a lot of places need renovation. We know, for instance, that some of the airports, a lot of the things are not ready in time, but nonetheless, it is a boost for the economy, no?
Of course, Brazil has a huge deficit in infrastructure, and even though a few of the terminals or a few of the new runways are not ready yet, we have to take into account that the air transit population in Brazil has jumped in the past 4 years from 40 to 120 million people, and it's predicted to double in the next 10 years. So yes, there are problems, of course. There are corruption issues which are not banal, which must be addressed. But there's also the fact that the planning structures of the federal government and even the state governments had been gutted in the past neoliberal era. So it's not easy to take out these huge contracts and that everything works out smoothly. And thus far, things have gone pretty well. That's my opinion on it.
All right, Rodrigo telling us at the outset of this conversation, he's a little conflicted about it all, about what's going on at the World Cup. So is legendary striker Romario. He's now a socialist lawmaker in Brazil. And as he himself admits, he's conflicted about the World Cup coming to Brazil.
Any conscientious Brazilian understands that the World Cup is not a positive thing for Brazil. That's what all conscientious Brazilians are saying. But that does not mean that during the World Cup, people won't support Brazil.
Cintia, will you cheer unabashedly for the Seleção?
Well, I mean, it'd be impossible for me not to support. So I'm sorry. I'm even in green. So it's been very hard for me not to support. Of course, well, I acknowledge all the wrongdoings in the preparation of this World Cup, and acknowledge that the FIFA, it's a very controversial organization, but it's...
Romario has been, to a certain degree, the anti-Pele. He's not at all somebody who's stuck to the official line on things.
Yeah, exactly. From the beginning, he was not against the World Cup in Brazil. He said he was against the way it was being handled. And of course, he was pretty much right about a lot of things regarding this organization. But even him is conflicted, and I believe in it. When they're going to start, the game now in the few hours, even him, Romario, was
he'll be supporting him.
He was supporting
110%.
Yeah, it's very difficult not to do it.
All right, another match that's playing out this Thursday ahead of the tournament. The head of FIFA, all but officially throwing his hat in the ring for another mandate.
Congress, you will decide who will take this great institution forward. It's your decision to do so. But I can tell you, I am ready to accompany you in the future for the game for the world. But it's your decision, Congress.
All right. Cue a hearty applause. Marc BURLEIGH.
Before I came in, I'm sort of reading all the Brazilian online stuff, Terra, all that sort of stuff. Now, if I've read it right, neither Sepp Blatter nor President Dilma, are going to give a speech opening the game in a couple of hours. It's very unusual that they don't do that, but from what I would understand, that's probably to avoid being booed on camera.
Yeah, and they will, if they would.
Yeah, if they showed their faces, they would be booed, and that's the political side of it coming to the fore. They want to avoid that at all.
And then you hear at the end of that clip the hearty applause that begins for Sepp Blatter.
Well, journalists here, we all know how press conferences can be stacked with certain supporters up the back of the room who are told to clap at a certain time. It doesn't mean that there is actually proper support behind that. I don't know. I think everybody has a certain idea that maybe he should be bowing out gracefully at this time rather than trying to get another mandate.
David GOLDBLATT, how much of the blame for all the controversy we've seen in the build-up to this World Cup do you put on the shoulders of Sepp Blatter and FIFA?
Well, to be fair to FIFA, and one isn't usually, the Brazilian government, indeed all governments who bid for the World Cup, know very well what they're in for if they examine the paperwork. When you sign up for the World Cup, as with the Olympics, you are going to sign away your sovereignty for the duration of the tournament. You are going to pay for the infrastructure. You are going to allow FIFA or the IOC to take their money in and out tax-free, etc., etc. So there really shouldn't have been any surprises. FIFA didn't do anything different in that regard with 2014 from South Africa 2010 or indeed Germany 2006. The question we've got to ask ourselves is whether the model of staging mega events that FIFA and the IOC have developed over the last 30 years is up to the task. And I think clearly one of the great things about the Brazilian protest is that it's forced those guys to think again. And that's where the problem is, not so much with FIFA being good guys or bad guys, but having an entire model for doing these things that is bound to be expensive, undemocratic, exclusionary, and really not as much fun as it should be.
At the end of the day, it's the members of FIFA, though, that will decide. Do you see changes coming in the future, David GOLDBLATT?
Well, I think if you saw Sepp Blatter at the ceremony at the FIFA Congress, where he was dancing and smiling and clicking his fingers, no change is coming. because Blatter demonstrated that despite the chaos around him, he is a maestro of power. He orchestrated his support from Asia, from Africa, from Central America, where, remember, he is loved and respected in the football world, and they will be keeping him in power in Zurich next year.
All right, and Rodrigo De Rezende, do you see a rethink on major sporting events after this tournament?
It's hard to say what will be coming out of Switzerland, but I'm pretty sure that Brazil or the Brazilian establishment will never get into such an adventure again without thinking twice.
They've got an adventure coming up anyway in 2 years' time.
They didn't get the warning soon
It'll be
enough.
interesting to see if any lessons are learned out of this. I'd be surprised, actually. But what'll be interesting is, for journalists, of course, we'll be speaking to the foreigners who go there and their experience of what they see on the ground. I think that will be actually a very positive experience, but that's purely thanks to the nature of the Brazilian people. You know, if you're standing around with the Brazilian people and things we would be grumbling as Europeans, the Brazilians have some sort of wellspring in them that make it a very positive, happy event despite the circumstances. And that's what's really interesting about this, is that we can see the demonstrations, and luckily the demonstrations took place. But if you're doing it on an interpersonal basis, you get the feeling that everything is okay and you're actually having a pretty good time, even in the middle of a pretty crappy situation.
All right, that good vibe, by the way, not extending to the head of the European football governing body, Frenchman Michel Platini, who says he won't be voting for Sepp Blatter next year. He's a potential rival for that post. But both Blatter and Platini have their problems when it comes to the bid that they awarded for the 2022 World Cup in Qatar. Do you see any changes at all in the way FIFA is run, in the way these tournaments are meted out, and whether or not that 2022 decision can be revoked?
Well, talk about two completely different World Cups. You've got Brazil, which is pretty much the sentimental heartland of football. I mean, no one would question that Brazil has a right to do it, and it'll be a World Cup to be watched. Qatar, on the other end, is sort of seen as a bit of a fix. Now the overall feeling that we're getting through the reports and everything going on is that money bought this game, and it's so totally divorced of what the beautiful game is supposed to be about. You know, I think it's really interesting seeing the difference between the two and how this is going to be handled. I wouldn't be surprised if Qatar loses the game.
David GOLDBLATT, do you agree that there could be a big enough blowback that something like that may happen?
It could happen. It could happen. Qatar are not entirely invulnerable. My sense is that the evidence that is going to be produced by Michael Garcia, the internal investigator from FIFA, is probably going to say everybody broke the rules, some more than others. Naughty boys, smack on the wrist, but they won't take it away from Qatar on that basis. But I rule nothing out.
All right, you rule nothing out. The Brazilians then will be afterwards looking ahead after this World Cup to not just the Olympics, but getting out of this high debt situation and renewing with the high growth that they enjoyed over the past decade. There's a U.S. journalist by the name of David Zirin who wrote a recent book called Brazil's Dance with the Devil. In it, he said that the World Cup, the Olympics, and Brazil's fight for democracies have the three Ds in them: displacement, debt, and defense. At the heart of the other three Ds, such as discontent and disgust. Is Brazil's going to have a rethink of the way it's run when all is said and done?
Well, I think there are a lot of thinking about. I mean, at the end of the World Cup, they're going to think back about hosting such events. They're going to think back about what's going to look ahead for Brazil. Because, of course, when Brazil had the decision to host the World Cup, it was another feeling, a great joy, pride. And, of course, it was Brazil wanted to show how modern and how emergent it was. So now for the future, I think at the end of the World Cup, they're going to, I hope, the politics and also population are going to learn a lesson from what has been done, how they have to handle the events and how they have to handle the expectations of the population, because at the end of the day, that was all the protests were about. How the government, they have to learn how to deal with the demanding and ever more demanding middle class. So that's the big lesson they have to retain, I'd say.
Rodrigo De Rezende?
Well, It's often said, people quote Stefan Zweig that said that Brazil is the country of the future. I think that the pulse that the streets taken to the government, to the Brazilian establishment, something will have to give out of it. And in the next few years, we'll see what it is. And hopefully it's a more democratic, a greater country.
Marc BURLEIGH?
Accountability is definitely needed, though. If that tradition, and it seemed to me to go against the Brazilian nature of having demonstrations, it was very heartening to see that they took place and they were so strong. I think more of that is needed because corruption is so rife in that country. Politics are driven by personality more than policy. It's the problems are really run very deep. Personally, I'd be surprised to see any sort of big sea change happening, but I'm very encouraged to see the demonstrations take place.
And a year ago when we were talking, the opposition was weak, but could Dilma Rousseff be voted out of office when she runs again?
It's very difficult to predict, but I don't think, the opposition, I think it is still weak. They're trying to profit perhaps from the World Cup, especially if it's a fiasco. But I think Dilma still, perhaps she's not going to win as easily, but I think she still has some margin to win.
All right, there'll be continuity there. David Goldblatt, you were mentioning a little earlier how the style of play on the pitch by the Brazilians, it's become a little more formatted. It's not as loose as it once was, and creative, perhaps, argue those who miss the old days. Would you say that both footballing and politically, the old Brazil is gone forever?
Yeah, it's like that. That's the era of the golden age, of an imagined world of extraordinary aesthetic football, much of which, of course, we never saw because it wasn't televised. And I think Brazil has been hankering for its golden age, both of football players and of better economic times. And I think in both ways, they're not coming back in the old way. So I hope one of the legacies of 2014 is Brazil finds a new way to celebrate its peculiar genius rather than lying on the golden age, which is no longer possible to reproduce.
David Goldblatt, I want to thank you for joining us from Bristol. I want to thank Rodrigo De Rezende, Marc BURLEIGH, Cintia CARDOSO. But before we say goodbye, let's say hello to James Creedon. It's time for our Media Watch segment. And James, of course, we've been talking about how we've been wondering, with all that's been going on, will all of this controversy blow over at 5 p.m. local time, right, when there's the whistle for the match Brazil versus Croatia?
Indeed, we're having some technical difficulties, unfortunately, Francois, but essentially, of the elements that I think are interesting this evening on social media, a huge drive by Brazil, by FIFA, and by many brands such as Coca-Cola to put a positive image on the World Cup this evening. You've got a flag of happiness with about 223,000 selfies that's going to be draped across the pitch in Sao Paulo this evening by Coca-Cola. So obviously eager to attach their image, the image of a soft drink that isn't altogether healthy for you, to happiness and a general feel-good factor. But a lot of images coming across social media this evening as well of those of that unrest in Sao Paulo, with journalists being hit, as well as tear gas affecting many people in the public. So that's obviously a negative image for Dilma Rousseff, a negative image for Brazil on front of the world's media. And polls just last week, the Pew Research Centre, saying that 61% of Brazilians in a completely football-mad country not believing that this World Cup is in fact something that is benefiting Brazil, that the money is being badly spent. And a huge amount of trivia. We'll see more of that at 8:45 Paris time for our Media Watch, when I'll be able to show it to you. But a huge amount of World Cup trivia across the world's media as well.
All right,
so more on that later.
61%. We'll see how that plays out, of course, once the tournament begins in earnest. Thanks, James Creedon. Thank you for joining us here for the France 24 debate.